In 1945, a peasant farmer digging for fertilizer near the Egyptian town of Nag Hammadi struck something hard with his mattock. What he pulled from the red earth that December day would shake the foundations of everything we thought we knew about early Christianity. 13 leather-bound codices filled with papyrus texts that had been buried for over 1,600 years. Texts that the early church had tried to erase from history forever. These weren't just any ancient manuscripts. These were the forbidden gospels, the secret teachings that powerful men had declared too dangerous for ordinary believers to read. For centuries, these texts existed only as rumors, whispered about in the shadows of theological debates. And now, suddenly, they were real. They were in our hands. And they were about to reveal secrets that would make some people very, very uncomfortable. Tonight, we're going deep into the Nag Hammadi discovery, the most significant archaeological find in the history of early Christianity. We're going to explore what these forbidden scrolls actually say, why they were buried, and most importantly, why certain institutions spent over a millennium ensuring you would never read them. Because what's written in these ancient pages doesn't just challenge what you think you know about Jesus and his followers. It suggests that the entire story of early Christianity might be far more complex, far more mystical, and far more deliberately obscured than anyone ever imagined. But here's what makes this discovery truly extraordinary. These texts weren't just accidentally lost to time. They were deliberately hidden by people who knew exactly what they were doing. People who understood that what they were preserving would one day matter. And when you read what they saved, you'll understand why powerful forces wanted these words erased from human memory forever. So settle in, because by the end of this journey, you're going to see early Christianity through completely different eyes. You're going to understand why these texts were considered so dangerous that possessing them could cost you your life. And you're going to discover secrets that were meant to stay buried in the desert sands of Egypt until the end of time. The year was 1945. Muhammad Ali al-Samman was not an archaeologist. He was not a scholar of ancient texts. He was a farmer from the village of Al-Qasr, working the fields near the Jabal al-Tarif cliffs, about 10 kilometers northeast of the town of Nag Hammadi in Upper Egypt. Like his father and his father's father, Muhammad Ali spent his days working the hard earth along the Nile, scraping together a living from soil that had sustained human civilization for thousands of years. But on this particular December morning, Muhammad Ali was searching for sabakh, a soft soil rich in nitrates that Egyptian farmers had used as fertilizer for generations. The best sabakh was often found in ancient burial sites, where organic matter had decomposed over millennia. So, when Muhammad Ali spotted a large earthenware jar buried at the base of a cliff, partially exposed by recent rains, his first thought wasn't about archaeology or history, it was about fertilizer. He raised his mattock and struck the jar. It shattered, releasing what he later described as a golden light. But instead of sabakh, out spilled 13 leather-bound books, their pages made of papyrus, their bindings cracked but intact. Muhammad Ali gathered them up, not knowing that he had just made the most important discovery in the history of early Christian studies. What happened next reveals just how precarious our knowledge of the ancient world really is. Muhammad Ali took the books home and gave them to his mother. She used some of the papyrus pages to kindle fires for cooking. Priceless texts that had survived 16 centuries in the Egyptian desert were reduced to ash in a peasant woman's oven. We will never know what was lost in those flames. But Muhammad Ali's mother wasn't the only one who failed to recognize the treasure that had been unearthed. When word of the discovery began to spread through the local antiquities market, these ancient books were treated as curiosities, sold piecemeal to dealers who had no idea what they were handling. Some pages were torn out and sold separately. Others were damaged by careless handling. For months, pieces of what would become known as the Nag Hammadi library were scattered across Egypt's black market, their true significance completely unrecognized. It was only when fragments began appearing in the shops of Cairo antiquities dealers that scholars started to pay attention. And when they did, they realized they were looking at something unprecedented. These weren't just any ancient Christian texts. These were copies of works that had been declared heretical by the early church, texts that were supposed to have been destroyed over a millennium ago. The first scholar to truly grasp the significance of the find was a Belgian professor named Jean Dorès. In 1947, 2 years after the discovery, Dorès examined some of the texts and immediately recognized their revolutionary importance. These weren't just ancient Christian writings. These were the lost Gospels of Gnosticism, a mystical branch of early Christianity that had been systematically suppressed by the Roman Catholic Church. But even as scholars began to understand what had been found, the texts themselves remained largely inaccessible. The Egyptian government declared the manuscripts national treasures and restricted access to a small circle of approved researchers. Political tensions in the region made scholarly collaboration difficult, and the manuscripts themselves were fragile, their papyrus pages cracking and crumbling after centuries in the desert. For decades, most of the Nag Hammadi texts remained unpublished, known only through brief scholarly descriptions and tantalizing excerpts. It wasn't until the 1972 that complete English translations began to appear, and even then, the full implications of the discovery were still being debated. What Muhammad Ali had found wasn't just a collection of ancient books. It was a library, carefully assembled and deliberately hidden by people who knew that what they were preserving was precious beyond measure. The 13 codices contained 52 separate texts, many of them previously unknown to modern scholarship. Here were Gospels attributed to Thomas, Philip, and Mary Magdalene. Here were secret teachings, supposedly given by Jesus to his closest disciples. Here were mystical treatises on the nature of God, creation, and the human soul that revealed a version of early Christianity unlike anything found in the New Testament. But perhaps most importantly, here was evidence that early Christianity was far more diverse, far more complex, and far more mystical than the simplified version that had survived in Orthodox churches. The Nag Hammadi texts revealed a hidden history, a secret tradition that had been deliberately erased from official Christian memory. And that erasure, as we'll discover, was not accidental. It was the result of a systematic campaign by early church leaders to eliminate competing versions of Christianity, to silence voices that offered different interpretations of Jesus' teachings, and to create the unified, hierarchical church that would dominate Western civilization for the next 2,000 years. The Nag Hammadi discovery gave us back those silenced voices. It revealed the diversity of early Christian thought that church leaders had worked so hard to suppress. And it raised uncomfortable questions about how much of Christianity's official history might be incomplete, sanitized, or deliberately distorted. To understand why these texts were buried, why they were considered so dangerous, and why they remained hidden for so long, we need to step back and examine the world of early Christianity. Because what the Nag Hammadi texts reveal isn't just an alternative version of Christian history. They reveal a deliberate campaign to control that history, to shape it according to the political and theological needs of those in power. In the first centuries after Jesus' death, Christianity was not the unified religion we know today. It was a collection of diverse communities, each with their own interpretations of Jesus' teachings, their own sacred texts, their own rituals and beliefs. Some Christians believed Jesus was fully divine. Others insisted he was fully human. Some saw salvation as a matter of faith alone. Others believed it required secret knowledge, mystical experience, or elaborate rituals. This diversity was not seen as a problem by early Christian communities. Different groups coexisted, shared ideas, and learned from each other. The letters of Paul reveal a Christianity that was already grappling with theological differences, but one that still had room for multiple perspectives and interpretations. But by the 2nd and 3rd centuries, certain Christian leaders began to see this diversity as a threat. They believed that Christianity needed to speak with one voice, to present a unified front to the Roman Empire and to competing religions. They began to argue that there was one true version of Christianity, one correct interpretation of Jesus' teachings, and one legitimate line of apostolic authority. This movement toward orthodoxy was not just theological, it was political. Christian leaders who could claim to represent the one true church would have more power, more influence, and more control over the growing Christian population. Those who taught different versions of Christianity were not just wrong, they were dangerous. They were heretics who threatened the very foundations of the faith. The process of defining orthodoxy required more than just declaring certain teachings correct. It required the systematic suppression of alternative viewpoints. Texts that supported non-orthodox interpretations had to be declared heretical. Communities that practiced different forms of Christianity had to be marginalized or absorbed, and teachers who refused to conform had to be silenced. This is the context in which the Nag Hammadi texts were written, copied, and eventually buried. They represent the voices of early Christians who found themselves on the losing side of this theological battle. They preserve teachings and perspectives that the emerging Orthodox Church declared heretical and tried to erase from history. But these weren't just random alternative viewpoints. The Nag Hammadi texts reveal a sophisticated theological tradition known as Gnosticism, a mystical form of Christianity that emphasized direct, personal knowledge of the divine over institutional authority and orthodox doctrine. The Gnostics believed that the material world was created not by the true God, but by a lesser divine being they called the demiurge. They taught that human souls contained a spark of the true divine light, trapped in physical bodies and ignorant of their true nature. And they claimed that Jesus came not to die for human sins, but to awaken humanity to this hidden truth, to provide the gnosis or knowledge that would allow souls to escape the material world and return to their divine source. These teachings were not just different from Orthodox Christianity, they were subversive. If salvation came through personal mystical knowledge rather than through the Church's sacraments, then the Church's claim to exclusive spiritual authority was meaningless. If the true God was not the creator of the material world, then the Hebrew Bible's account of creation was false. And if Jesus' primary mission was to impart secret knowledge rather than to establish a church hierarchy, then the entire structure of institutional Christianity was built on a misunderstanding. No wonder the early church leaders saw Gnosticism as an existential threat. These weren't just theological disagreements about minor points of doctrine. This was a completely different vision of what Christianity was supposed to be. And if the Gnostics were right, then everything the Orthodox Church was building, every claim to authority they were making, every structure of power they were creating, was fundamentally illegitimate. So, the Church fought back, and they fought with everything they had. By the 4th century, when Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire under Constantine, the gloves came off completely. Orthodox bishops now had the full power of the imperial government behind them. Heretical texts weren't just discouraged, they were banned. Possessing them became a crime punishable by death. And those who taught Gnostic doctrines weren't just excommunicated, they were hunted down, imprisoned, and executed. The Theodosian Code, issued in 438 CE, made the possession of heretical books a capital offense. Imperial soldiers would sweep through Christian communities, searching homes and churches for forbidden texts. When they found them, the books were publicly burned, and their owners faced trial for treason against both church and state. It was systematic, it was brutal, and it was extraordinarily effective. This is why the Nag Hammadi discovery was so shocking to modern scholars. For over 1,500 years, most of these texts existed only as titles mentioned in the writings of Orthodox Church Fathers who condemned them. Scholars knew that Gnostic Gospels had once existed, but they had no idea what these Gospels actually said. The Church's campaign of suppression had been so thorough that the actual content of Gnostic Christianity had been almost completely erased from human memory. But someone, somewhere in Upper Egypt, refused to let these texts die. The evidence suggests that the Nag Hammadi codices were buried sometime in the late 4th century, probably around 367 CE. This date is significant because it corresponds exactly with a famous letter issued by Athanasius, the powerful bishop of Alexandria. In his 39th festal letter, Athanasius provided the first official list of books that should be included in the Christian Bible. But more importantly for our story, he also explicitly condemned the reading of any non-canonical texts. Athanasius didn't just suggest that Christians avoid these books, he ordered that they be destroyed. And he had the power to enforce that order throughout Egypt, where his authority as Archbishop of Alexandria was absolute. The letter was distributed to every church and monastery in the region, with clear instructions that any forbidden texts were to be surrendered immediately for destruction. But someone at the Pachomian monastery near Nag Hammadi made a different choice. Instead of burning their collection of Gnostic texts, they carefully wrapped them in leather, sealed them in a large jar, and buried them at the base of the Jabal al-Tarif cliffs. They knew they were taking an enormous risk. If they were caught, they would face not just excommunication, but execution. But they also knew that what they were preserving was irreplaceable. Think about that for a moment. These anonymous monks understood that they were living through a historical moment when an entire tradition of Christian thought was being systematically eliminated. They could see the future clearly enough to know that if they didn't act, these texts would be lost forever. So they chose to become criminals in the eyes of their own church, rather than allow that knowledge to disappear. And they were right. Within a few decades, Gnostic Christianity had been so thoroughly suppressed that most people forgot it had ever existed. The texts that the Nag Hammadi monks buried were among the last surviving copies of these works anywhere in the world. If Muhammad Ali hadn't stumbled across that jar in 1945, we might never have known what the Gnostics actually believed. But what exactly did those forbidden texts contain? What secrets were considered so dangerous that possessing them could cost you your life? The answer is both simpler and more radical than you might expect. The Nag Hammadi texts don't just offer a different version of Christianity, they offer a fundamentally different understanding of reality itself. Take the Gospel of Thomas, perhaps the most famous text in the collection. Unlike the canonical Gospels, Thomas contains no narrative about Jesus' life, death, or resurrection. Instead, it presents 114 sayings attributed to Jesus, many of them cryptic, mystical, and completely unlike anything found in the New Testament. Jesus said, "If those who lead you say to you, 'See, the kingdom is in the sky,' then the birds of the sky will precede you. If they say to you, 'It is in the sea,' then the fish will precede you. Rather, the kingdom is inside of you, and it is outside of you. When you come to know yourselves, then you will become known, and you will realize that it is you who are the sons of the living Father." This isn't the Jesus of Orthodox Christianity, who established a church hierarchy and promised salvation through faith in his sacrificial death. This is a Jesus who teaches that the kingdom of God is not a place you go to after death, but a state of consciousness you can achieve in this life through self-knowledge. This is a Jesus who tells his followers that they don't need priests or bishops or sacraments to reach the divine, because the divine is already within them. Or consider the Gospel of Philip, which contains some of the most controversial passages in the entire Nag Hammadi collection. Philip presents Jesus as a teacher of sacred mysteries, someone who revealed different levels of truth to different disciples based on their ability to understand. The companion of the Savior is Mary Magdalene, but Christ loved her more than all the disciples and used to kiss her often on her mouth. The rest of the disciples were offended by it and expressed disapproval. They said to him, "Why do you love her more than all of us?" The Savior answered and said to them, "Why do I not love you like her?" This passage has sparked endless debate among scholars. Some see it as evidence that Jesus was married to Mary Magdalene. Others interpret it symbolically as representing the soul's intimate relationship with the divine. But regardless of how you interpret it, the implications are clear. This text presents a Jesus whose relationship with women was radically different from what Orthodox Christianity taught. The Gospel of Philip goes even further, suggesting that Mary Magdalene was not just Jesus' companion but his successor, the disciple who received his deepest teachings. In a tradition that would eventually exclude women from all positions of religious authority, this was not just heretical, it was revolutionary. But perhaps the most radical text in the entire collection is the Apocryphon of John, a complex mystical treatise that presents a completely different account of creation itself. According to this text, the God of the Hebrew Bible is not the true divine source, but a false god called the Demiurge, who created the material world as a prison for human souls. The true God, according to the Apocryphon, exists in a realm of pure light and consciousness, far beyond the physical universe. Human souls are sparks of this divine light, trapped in material bodies and ignorant of their true nature. The Demiurge and his archons, or rulers, work to keep humanity in this state of ignorance because awakened souls would escape their control and return to the realm of light. Jesus, in this account, is not the son of the Demiurge, but an emissary from the true God, sent to awaken humanity to its divine nature. His mission is not to die for human sins, but to provide the gnosis, the secret knowledge that will allow souls to escape the material prison and return to their divine source. This cosmology was not just different from Orthodox Christianity, it was its complete opposite. If the Gnostics were right, then the entire Hebrew Bible was a lie, the material world was a prison, and the God worshipped by Orthodox Christians was actually an evil impostor. Everything that mainstream Christianity taught about creation, salvation, and the nature of God was not just wrong, but actively harmful. You can see why church leaders considered these ideas so dangerous. They didn't just challenge Orthodox doctrine, they undermined the very foundations of biblical religion itself, and they offered an alternative path to salvation that completely bypassed church authority. But the Gnostic texts found at Nag Hammadi go even deeper than theology. They reveal a sophisticated psychological and philosophical system that in many ways anticipates modern depth psychology and mystical philosophy. The Gnostics understood that human consciousness operates on multiple levels, that most people live in a state of spiritual sleep, and that awakening to one's true nature requires a fundamental transformation of perception. They developed elaborate meditation practices, visualization techniques, and ritual procedures designed to facilitate this awakening. They created myths and symbols that encoded practical instructions for spiritual development, and they built communities of practice where seekers could support each other in their journey toward gnosis. This was not primitive superstition or wishful thinking. This was a sophisticated spiritual technology, refined over centuries of practice and teaching. And it was this sophistication that made Gnosticism so attractive to educated Christians in the ancient world, and so threatening to church leaders who preferred their followers to remain spiritually dependent. The Nag Hammadi texts preserve this lost wisdom tradition in remarkable detail. They give us access to teachings and practices that Orthodox Christianity declared too dangerous for ordinary believers to know, and they reveal just how much of early Christian spirituality was deliberately suppressed in the process of creating institutional orthodoxy. But here's what makes the Nag Hammadi discovery truly extraordinary. These texts don't just challenge our understanding of early Christianity. They challenge our understanding of how religious history itself is created and controlled. The texts scattered across those 13 codices reveal something that Orthodox Christianity has never wanted you to know. The early church didn't just suppress alternative gospels because they were theologically incorrect. They suppressed them because they contained practical instructions for achieving the very spiritual experiences that Orthodox Christianity claimed were impossible for ordinary believers. Consider the secret book of James, where Jesus tells his disciples that they can achieve the same divine consciousness he possessed. Or the dialogue of the Savior, where Jesus teaches specific techniques for transcending ordinary awareness and accessing higher dimensions of reality. These weren't just theological treatises. They were instruction manuals for mystical experience. The Gospel of Mary presents perhaps the most detailed account of these practices that survived the Church's campaign of destruction. In this text, Mary Magdalene describes a vision she received directly from Jesus, complete with practical guidance on how to navigate the spiritual realms and overcome the archons, or spiritual forces, that keep human souls trapped in ignorance. But when Mary shares this vision with the other disciples, they reject it. Peter explicitly questions whether Jesus would really give such important teachings to a woman rather than to the male apostles. And here, buried in an ancient Gnostic text, we see the same dynamics that would eventually lead to the systematic exclusion of women from Christian spiritual authority. The text doesn't just record this conflict, it takes sides. Mary responds to Peter's challenge by saying, "Do you think I have made this up myself, or that I am lying about the Savior?" And another disciple, Levi, defends her by pointing out that Jesus clearly loved Mary more than the other disciples and chose to reveal his deepest teachings to her. This wasn't just an ancient theological debate. It was a power struggle over who had the right to interpret Jesus' teachings and lead Christian communities. And the Gospel of Mary makes it clear that in at least some early Christian circles, women were recognized as having equal and sometimes superior spiritual authority. Orthodox Christianity would eventually resolve this tension by declaring that Jesus gave his authority exclusively to the male apostles, particularly Peter. But the Nag Hammadi texts preserve evidence of a very different tradition, one in which spiritual authority was based on direct mystical experience rather than apostolic succession, and in which women could be recognized as the most advanced spiritual teachers. The implications of this alternative history are staggering. If the Gnostic texts are accurate, then the subordination of women in Christianity wasn't based on Jesus' teachings, but on later political decisions by church leaders who found it convenient to exclude half of humanity from spiritual leadership. But the suppression of women's spiritual authority was just one aspect of a much larger campaign by early church leaders to centralize religious power in their own hands. The Nag Hammadi texts reveal that early Christianity included traditions where spiritual authority came from direct mystical experience, where secret teachings were passed down through initiatory lineages, and where individual seekers could achieve the same divine consciousness that Orthodox Christianity reserved for Jesus alone. The testimony of truth presents this conflict in stark terms. This text criticizes Orthodox Christian leaders for creating a religion based on fear rather than knowledge, for demanding blind faith rather than encouraging direct spiritual experience, and for building institutional hierarchies that separate believers from the divine rather than connecting them to it. According to the testimony of truth, Orthodox Christianity had gotten everything backwards. Instead of helping people achieve gnosis, it kept them in ignorance. Instead of encouraging direct spiritual experience, it demanded submission to priestly authority. Instead of teaching that the kingdom of heaven was within each person, it taught that salvation could only be achieved through church sacraments administered by ordained clergy. This wasn't just theological criticism, it was a systematic deconstruction of everything that institutional Christianity was becoming, and it explained exactly why church leaders considered Gnostic texts so dangerous. These writings didn't just offer alternative interpretations of Christian doctrine, they revealed that Orthodox Christianity itself might be a corruption of Jesus' original teachings. The Thunder, Perfect Mind takes this critique even further. This remarkable text, written in the voice of a divine feminine figure, directly challenges the patriarchal assumptions that were becoming embedded in Orthodox Christianity. The speaker declares herself to be both the honored one and the scorned one, both the holy one and the prostitute, both the mother and the daughter. This isn't just poetic language, it's a sophisticated theological statement about the nature of divinity itself. While Orthodox Christianity was developing increasingly rigid categories about good and evil, sacred and profane, male and female, the Gnostic texts preserved a more fluid, paradoxical understanding of divine reality. But perhaps most threatening of all to church authorities was the way these texts demystified the process of spiritual development. Instead of presenting salvation as something that happened to you through God's grace, mediated by church sacraments, the Gnostic texts provided step-by-step instructions for achieving mystical states through your own efforts. The Gospel of Philip explains that there are different levels of spiritual understanding, and that advanced practitioners can access higher mysteries that remain hidden from beginners. The Apocryphon of John provides detailed maps of the spiritual realms and practical guidance for navigating them. The Gospel of Thomas offers cryptic sayings that function as meditation koans, designed to trigger sudden shifts in consciousness. These texts treated spiritual development as a skill that could be learned, practiced, and mastered. They assumed that ordinary people could achieve extraordinary states of consciousness if they were given the right teachings and applied them consistently, and they provided detailed instructions for doing exactly that. This practical approach to mystical experience was revolutionary in the ancient world, and it remains revolutionary today. Most religious traditions, then and now, teach that the highest spiritual states are rare gifts reserved for special individuals, or that they require years of preparation under qualified teachers. But the Gnostic texts suggested that anyone could access these states directly if they understood the proper methods. The Book of Thomas the Contender makes this point explicitly. Jesus tells Thomas that whoever has come to understand the world has found only a corpse, and whoever has found a corpse is superior to the world. This isn't metaphorical language. It's a practical instruction for shifting perception away from material concerns towards spiritual realities. Similarly, the Gospel of Philip provides specific techniques for what it calls dying before you die, a practice of consciously separating awareness from identification with the physical body while still alive. This isn't just mystical philosophy. It's practical instruction for achieving the out-of-body experiences that advanced Gnostic practitioners considered essential for spiritual development. But here's what makes these instructions even more remarkable. They work. Modern practitioners who have experimented with Gnostic techniques often report achieving the same types of mystical experiences described in these ancient texts. The methods preserved in the Nag Hammadi library weren't just theoretical speculation. They were practical technologies for altering consciousness, refined through centuries of experimentation by communities of dedicated practitioners. This is why the early church considered these texts so dangerous. They didn't just challenge orthodox doctrine. They provided ordinary people with tools for achieving the very spiritual experiences that Orthodox Christianity claimed were impossible without divine intervention, mediated through church sacraments. If anyone could achieve gnosis through their own efforts, then what was the point of priests, bishops, and ecclesiastical hierarchy? If the kingdom of heaven was accessible through meditation and mystical practice, then why did people need to wait for salvation in the afterlife? If divine consciousness was the natural birthright of every human being, then why should anyone submit to religious authorities who claimed exclusive access to spiritual truth? The Nag Hammadi texts answered these questions in ways that completely undermined the institutional Christianity that was emerging in the 4th century. They preserved teachings that made religious hierarchy unnecessary, priestly mediation irrelevant, and ecclesiastical authority obsolete. No wonder church leaders wanted them destroyed. But the monks who buried these texts understood something that their bishops apparently didn't. They recognized that spiritual truth couldn't be eliminated by burning books or executing teachers. They knew that somewhere, sometime, these teachings would be needed again. And they were willing to risk everything to make sure that future generations would have access to the wisdom that their own generation was trying to destroy. When Muhammad Ali broke open that jar in 1945, he wasn't just uncovering ancient manuscripts. He was releasing teachings that had been imprisoned for 16 centuries, ideas that had been declared too dangerous for human consumption, and practices that had been banned because they worked too well. The Nag Hammadi discovery didn't just give us back a lost chapter of Christian history. It revealed how that history had been deliberately rewritten by people who understood exactly what they were suppressing and why. And it raised questions that Orthodox Christianity still hasn't figured out how to answer. Because once you read these texts, once you understand what they actually say, you can never again accept the simplified version of early Christianity that most people take for granted. You realize that the triumph of orthodoxy wasn't inevitable. It was the result of specific political decisions made by specific people at specific moments in history. And you begin to wonder what Christianity might have become if those decisions had been different. The forbidden scrolls of Nag Hammadi don't just challenge our understanding of the past, they challenge our assumptions about religious authority, spiritual development, and human potential itself. They suggest that the mystical experiences reserved for saints and prophets in Orthodox tradition might actually be accessible to anyone willing to undertake the necessary practices. And they raise the most dangerous question of all. If these teachings were suppressed once, what else has been hidden from us? What other wisdom traditions have been buried? What other spiritual technologies have been banned? What other possibilities for human development have been declared too dangerous for public consumption? The answers to those questions begin to emerge when we examine exactly what happened to the Gnostic communities after their texts were banned. Because the suppression of these teachings wasn't just an intellectual exercise, it was a systematic campaign of cultural destruction that reveals how power actually works when it feels threatened. In the decades following Athanasius's letter, imperial soldiers swept through Egypt like a tide of organized forgetting. They didn't just search monasteries and churches. They invaded private homes, interrogated family members, and offered rewards for information about hidden texts. The campaign was so thorough that within a single generation, communities that had practiced Gnostic Christianity for centuries simply vanished from the historical record. But here's what's truly chilling about this process. The Church didn't just destroy the books. They systematically erased the memory that these books had ever existed. They rewrote the history of early Christianity to make it seem like orthodoxy had always been the dominant tradition, like the diversity of early Christian thought had never really existed in the first place. This wasn't accidental. It was a deliberate strategy of what modern historians call damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory itself. The goal wasn't just to eliminate heretical ideas, but to eliminate any evidence that those ideas had ever been taken seriously by intelligent, devout Christians. Consider how effectively this strategy worked. For over 1,500 years, scholars believed that Gnosticism had been a minor, marginal movement within early Christianity, a collection of bizarre speculations that had naturally died out because they were obviously inferior to orthodox teaching. The Church Fathers who wrote against Gnosticism were seen as defending obvious truth against transparent error. But the Nag Hammadi texts revealed that this historical narrative was completely fabricated. Gnosticism hadn't been marginal at all. In some regions, it had been the dominant form of Christianity, and the ideas that Orthodox writers dismissed as obviously ridiculous were actually sophisticated philosophical and psychological systems that had attracted some of the most brilliant minds of the ancient world. The Gospel of Truth, attributed to the Gnostic teacher Valentinus, demonstrates just how sophisticated these systems really were. Valentinus wasn't some wild-eyed fanatic spinning bizarre fantasies. He was a highly educated philosopher who had studied in Alexandria, the intellectual center of the ancient world. He understood Greek philosophy, Jewish mysticism, and Christian theology better than most of his Orthodox contemporaries. And his Gospel of Truth reveals a mind grappling seriously with fundamental questions about the nature of reality, consciousness, and human suffering. Valentinus didn't reject Orthodox Christianity because he was ignorant or deluded. He rejected it because he had found something deeper, more transformative, and more practically effective. The Father reveals his bosom. Now his bosom is the Holy Spirit. He reveals what is hidden of him. What is hidden of him is his Son, so that through the mercies of the Father the aeons may know him and cease laboring in search of the Father, resting there in him, knowing that this is the rest. This isn't the language of a cult leader or a religious fanatic. This is the language of someone who has achieved genuine mystical insight and is trying to communicate that insight to others. Valentinus understood that human suffering comes from a sense of separation from the divine source, and he developed practical methods for healing that separation through direct spiritual experience. But Orthodox Christianity couldn't tolerate this level of sophistication in its opponents. It was much easier to dismiss Gnostic teachers as heretics and charlatans than to engage seriously with their ideas. So, the Church created a propaganda campaign that portrayed Gnosticism as a collection of absurd beliefs held by gullible people who had been deceived by false teachers. This propaganda was so effective that it fooled historians for over a millennium. Even today, many people's first exposure to Gnosticism comes through the writings of Church Fathers like Irenaeus and Tertullian, who had obvious political motivations for misrepresenting Gnostic teachings. It's like learning about democracy from the writings of dictators who wanted to discredit it. The Nag Hammadi texts allow us to hear Gnostic voices speaking for themselves for the first time in 16 centuries. And what we hear is completely different from what the Church Fathers claimed these people believed. Instead of bizarre mythologies and immoral practices, we find sophisticated spiritual psychology and practical methods for achieving higher states of consciousness. The Tripartite Tractate, for example, presents a cosmological system that anticipates many insights of modern depth psychology. It describes how consciousness becomes fragmented through identification with material existence, how this fragmentation creates suffering and confusion, and how healing occurs through remembering one's true spiritual nature. This isn't primitive superstition. This is a remarkably sophisticated understanding of human psychology that wouldn't be matched in Western thought until the work of Carl Jung in the 20th century. Jung himself acknowledged his debt to Gnostic psychology and spent years studying the Nag Hammadi texts after their discovery. But the suppression of Gnostic Christianity wasn't just about eliminating alternative theological ideas. It was about consolidating power in the hands of a religious hierarchy that demanded absolute obedience from its followers. The Gnostic emphasis on personal spiritual experience threatened this hierarchy at its very foundation. If individuals could achieve gnosis through their own efforts, they didn't need priestly mediation. If the kingdom of heaven was within each person, they didn't need ecclesiastical sacraments. If spiritual authority came from direct mystical experience rather than apostolic succession, then bishops and popes had no special claim to religious leadership. The letter of Peter to Philip makes this threat explicit. In this text, the apostles ask Jesus how they can overcome the spiritual forces that keep humanity in ignorance. Jesus responds by teaching them specific practices for achieving higher consciousness and accessing divine knowledge directly. He doesn't tell them to establish a church hierarchy or create sacramental systems. He gives them tools for spiritual self-liberation. This was exactly what church leaders couldn't allow. They needed Christianity to remain dependent on institutional authority, not just for political reasons, but for economic ones as well. The emerging Catholic Church was becoming enormously wealthy through donations, land holdings, and political alliances. If Christians could achieve salvation through their own spiritual practices, they might stop supporting the ecclesiastical institutions that claim to be necessary for their eternal welfare. So the Church created a theology that made personal spiritual experience suspect and potentially dangerous. They taught that mystical visions might come from demons rather than God, that individual interpretation of Scripture was unreliable without official church guidance, and that the highest spiritual achievements were reserved for specially ordained clergy who had received divine authority through apostolic succession. This theology wasn't based on Jesus' teachings as recorded in the canonical Gospels. It was a political innovation designed to maintain institutional control over Christian spiritual life. And the Nag Hammadi texts preserve evidence of what Christianity looked like before this theological system was imposed. The Gospel of the Egyptians describes Christian communities where spiritual authority was fluid and democratic, where women and men participated equally in religious leadership, and where the goal of spiritual practice was to help each individual achieve the same divine consciousness that Jesus had demonstrated. These communities didn't need bishops to tell them what to believe, or priests to perform salvation rituals for them. They had developed their own methods for accessing divine knowledge directly, and they trusted their own spiritual experiences more than any external authority. The Apocalypse of Adam goes even further, suggesting that true gnosis doesn't require any connection to historical Christianity at all. According to this text, the divine spark within human consciousness is older than any religious tradition and can be awakened through practices that transcend all institutional boundaries. This was the ultimate heresy from the Church's perspective. Not only did it make Christian institutions unnecessary, it suggested that spiritual truth could be found outside of Christianity entirely. If the Gnostics were right, then religious exclusivism was not just wrong but actively harmful to spiritual development. The paraphrase of Shem presents this universalist vision in remarkable detail. According to this text, divine consciousness manifests through many different cultural forms, and no single religious tradition has a monopoly on spiritual truth. The goal of spiritual practice is not to convert others to your particular beliefs, but to help them discover the divine reality that already exists within their own consciousness. This kind of religious pluralism was completely incompatible with the imperial Christianity that emerged in the 4th century. Constantine and his successors needed a unified church that could serve as a tool of political control throughout the Roman Empire. They couldn't tolerate religious movements that taught spiritual independence and cultural tolerance. So they didn't just suppress Gnostic texts, they created legal and social systems that made Gnostic ideas literally unthinkable for most people. Possessing heretical books became a capital crime. Teaching non-orthodox ideas became treason against the state. And expressing doubt about official church doctrine became evidence of demonic possession. This system of thought control was so effective that it survived the fall of the Roman Empire and continued to shape Western consciousness for over 1,000 years. Even today, many people find it difficult to imagine that early Christianity could have been radically different from the institutional forms they're familiar with. The teachings of Silvanus reveals just how different things might have been. This text presents a form of Christian philosophy that integrates Greek wisdom, Jewish mysticism, and Jesus' teachings into a sophisticated system for spiritual development. Instead of demanding blind faith in church authority, it encourages critical thinking, philosophical inquiry, and personal experimentation with spiritual practices. My son, why do you continue in ignorance? Learn, for he who learns will become wise. Try to understand, for he who understands will become learned. Be sober and shake off drunkenness, which is ignorance. This doesn't sound like the Christianity most people know. It sounds more like ancient Greek philosophy or Buddhist psychology. And that's exactly the point. The Gnostic Christians weren't trying to create a separate religion. They were trying to integrate the best insights from all wisdom traditions into a practical system for human liberation. But institutional Christianity couldn't tolerate this kind of intellectual freedom. It needed followers who would accept official doctrine without question, not philosophers who might develop their own understanding of spiritual reality. So it created a theology that portrayed intellectual curiosity as spiritual pride and independent thinking as rebellion against God. The effects of this theological system extended far beyond Christianity itself. By suppressing traditions that encouraged direct spiritual experience and intellectual independence, the Church helped create a culture that was suspicious of mysticism, hostile to philosophical inquiry, and dependent on external authority for truth. This culture would eventually produce the scientific revolution as a reaction against religious dogmatism, but it would also create forms of materialism that denied the reality of spiritual experience altogether. The suppression of Gnostic Christianity didn't just eliminate alternative forms of religion. It helped create the split between science and spirituality that still characterizes Western thought today. The Nag Hammadi texts offer us a glimpse of what might have been a culture that integrated rational inquiry with mystical experience, that honored both scientific investigation and spiritual development, that encouraged both critical thinking and direct encounter with transcendent reality. The discourse on the 8th and 9th presents this integration in practical terms. This text describes a mystical experience that involves both careful preparation through study and meditation and spontaneous breakthrough into higher consciousness. The practitioner doesn't abandon reason in favor of faith or reject spiritual experience in favor of materialism. Instead, they use both rational and intuitive faculties to explore the full spectrum of human consciousness. This kind of integral approach to knowledge was common in Gnostic communities, but became almost impossible within Orthodox Christianity. The Church's insistence on doctrinal uniformity and institutional authority made it very difficult for Christians to pursue the kind of open-ended inquiry that spiritual development requires. But the Gnostic texts preserved in the Nag Hammadi library demonstrate that this limitation wasn't inevitable. Early Christianity could have developed very differently if political circumstances had been different. And reading these texts today can help us imagine what a mature spirituality might look like, one that honors both the rational and mystical dimensions of human experience, that encourages both individual development and community support, that respects both ancient wisdom and contemporary insight. The question is, are we ready for that kind of spirituality now? Are we prepared to take seriously the possibility that the suppressed traditions preserved in these ancient texts might have something valuable to offer our contemporary world? Because that's what the Nag Hammadi discovery ultimately challenges us to consider. These texts weren't just preserved by accident. They were hidden by people who understood that spiritual truth couldn't be permanently suppressed, that human consciousness would eventually evolve beyond the limitations that 4th century church leaders tried to impose on it. The monks who buried these scrolls in the Egyptian desert were betting on the future. They were gambling that someday humanity would be mature enough to handle the spiritual technologies that their own generation had declared too dangerous for public use. In 1945, Muhammad Ali's mattock broke open more than just an ancient jar. It cracked open 16 centuries of imposed forgetting and released ideas that are still spreading through human consciousness, like ripples across a pond. The question now is, what are we going to do with what we've found? The ripples from that broken jar continue to spread in ways that would have terrified the bishops who tried to bury these teachings forever. Because what Muhammad Ali unleashed wasn't just ancient history. It was a living transmission of consciousness, altering knowledge that modern researchers are only beginning to understand. In laboratories across the world today, neuroscientists are discovering that the human brain possesses capacities that mainstream science has only recently begun to acknowledge. States of consciousness that the Gnostics described in precise detail 2,000 years ago are now being mapped using brain imaging technology. The mystical experiences that church leaders declared impossible are being reproduced in controlled laboratory settings. Dr. Robin Carhart Harris at Imperial College London has used advanced neuroimaging to study what happens in the brain during profound spiritual experiences. His research reveals that these states involve a dramatic reorganization of neural activity, a dissolution of the default mode network that normally maintains our sense of separate selfhood. The brain literally rewires itself during mystical experience, creating new patterns of connectivity that can persist long after the experience itself has ended. This isn't just abstract neuroscience. It's confirmation of something the Gnostic texts described with remarkable accuracy. The Gospel of Philip explains that gnosis involves a fundamental shift in how consciousness organizes itself, a movement from fragmented awareness to unified perception. The dialogue of the Savior provides step-by-step instructions for achieving exactly the kind of neural reorganization that modern brain research has now documented. But here's what makes this convergence between ancient wisdom and modern science truly extraordinary. The Gnostic texts don't just describe these states of consciousness. They provide practical methods for accessing them safely and integrating them productively into daily life. The secret book of James, for instance, contains what modern researchers would recognize as sophisticated protocols for set and setting, preparation, and integration. It explains how to create the psychological and environmental conditions necessary for profound spiritual experience, how to navigate challenging states of consciousness, and how to translate mystical insights into practical wisdom. These weren't primitive superstitions. They were refined technologies of consciousness, developed through centuries of careful experimentation by communities of dedicated practitioners. and they work with the same reliability today as they did in the 4th century. Dr. William Richards, a psychologist at Johns Hopkins University who has spent decades studying mystical experience, has noted remarkable similarities between the accounts of consciousness transformation described in ancient Gnostic texts and the reports of modern subjects who undergo profound spiritual experiences in clinical settings. The phenomenology is virtually identical across cultures and centuries. The thunder, perfect mind, describes experiences of ego dissolution, unity consciousness, and encounters with archetypal feminine wisdom that match precisely what contemporary researchers observe in their laboratories. The Apocryphon of John provides detailed maps of non-ordinary states of consciousness that correspond exactly to the stages of mystical experience documented by modern psychology. This convergence suggests something that Orthodox Christianity has never wanted to admit. The Gnostics weren't deluded fanatics spinning bizarre fantasies. They were sophisticated researchers of consciousness who had developed empirical methods for exploring the furthest reaches of human awareness. But their research threatened more than just religious orthodoxy. It challenged the fundamental assumptions about reality that Western civilization had built upon for over a millennium. If consciousness could be systematically expanded beyond ordinary awareness, if human beings possessed capacities for direct spiritual knowledge that didn't require institutional mediation, if the boundaries between self and cosmos were more fluid than anyone had imagined, then everything that Western culture took for granted about human nature and spiritual possibility would have to be reconsidered. The teachings of Silvanus makes this challenge explicit. This text doesn't just describe mystical experiences. It presents a complete epistemology, a way of knowing that integrates rational analysis with direct spiritual perception. According to Silvanus, human consciousness naturally possesses multiple ways of accessing truth, and the highest knowledge comes from learning to coordinate all of these capacities simultaneously. Do not be materialistic. Matter gives birth to envy. Even if you become numerous, do not increase, but decrease, and what you have gained, let it be as if you had not gained it. This isn't anti-intellectual mysticism. It's a sophisticated understanding of how consciousness works, one that recognizes both the value and the limitations of different modes of awareness. The text encourages rigorous intellectual development, while warning against the kind of materialistic thinking that reduces reality to what can be measured and manipulated. Modern cognitive science has begun to validate this multidimensional approach to knowledge. Researchers like Dr. John Vervaeke at the University of Toronto have demonstrated that human intelligence involves multiple processing systems that normally operate independently but can be trained to work together in ways that dramatically enhance both rational and intuitive capacities. The practices described in Gnostic texts appear to be precisely the kind of training protocols that neuroscientists now recognize as capable of integrating these different cognitive systems. The Gospel of Thomas presents what modern researchers would call contemplative practices designed to develop metacognitive awareness. The Gospel of Philip describes visualization techniques that contemporary psychology recognizes as effective methods for accessing normally unconscious mental processes. But the Gnostic texts go beyond anything that mainstream psychology has yet developed. They describe states of consciousness that transcend the ordinary boundaries of individual awareness, experiences of direct communion with what they called the divine pleroma, or fullness of being. The tripartite tractate provides perhaps the most detailed account of these transpersonal states. According to this text, individual consciousness is not separate from cosmic consciousness, but is a localized expression of it. Through proper spiritual practice, the boundaries between personal and universal awareness can be dissolved, allowing direct participation in what the text calls the undivided unity of divine being. This description corresponds remarkably to what contemporary researchers have documented in studies of profound mystical experience. Dr. Roland Griffiths at Johns Hopkins has found that subjects who undergo deep spiritual experiences consistently report encounters with what they describe as ultimate reality, cosmic consciousness, or divine presence. These experiences are not hallucinations or delusions, but appear to involve genuine contact with dimensions of reality that normally remain hidden from ordinary awareness. The Nag Hammadi texts suggest that early Christian communities had developed systematic methods for accessing these dimensions of reality. They weren't waiting passively for divine grace to descend upon them. They were actively exploring the furthest reaches of human consciousness, using techniques that modern science is only beginning to understand. The Gospel of the Egyptians describes what appears to be a complete curriculum for consciousness development, starting with basic meditation practices and progressing through increasingly sophisticated methods for transcending ordinary awareness. The text provides detailed instructions for what it calls ascending through the eons, a process that contemporary researchers would recognize as systematic exploration of different levels of consciousness. These weren't just individual practices. The Gnostic communities developed sophisticated support systems for people undergoing profound consciousness transformation. They understood that mystical experience could be destabilizing if not properly integrated, and they created community structures designed to help practitioners make sense of their experiences and translate their insights into practical wisdom. The letter of Peter to Philip reveals how these support systems actually functioned when them alone. They come together as a community to share their experiences, interpret their meaning, and develop. The apostles encounter challenging spiritual experiences. They don't face strategies for applying their insights to the practical challenges of spiritual life. This communal approach to spiritual development was radically different from the hierarchical model that Orthodox Christianity would eventually adopt. Instead of having designated spiritual authorities who told everyone else what their experiences meant, Gnostic communities encouraged peer-to-peer learning and collective discernment. The dialogue of the Savior demonstrates how this process worked in practice. When disciples report mystical visions or insights, Jesus doesn't simply validate or reject their experiences. Instead, he helps them develop the interpretive skills necessary to understand their experiences for themselves. He teaches them to become their own spiritual authorities rather than remaining dependent on external guidance. This emphasis on spiritual autonomy was precisely what church leaders found so threatening about Gnostic communities. If people could learn to interpret their own spiritual experiences, if they could develop direct access to divine knowledge, if they could support each other's spiritual development without requiring professional religious mediation, then what was the point of having a church hierarchy at all? The answer, from the church's perspective, was that there wasn't one, which is why they worked so systematically to eliminate not just Gnostic texts, but the entire culture of spiritual independence that these texts represented. But that culture didn't disappear entirely. It went underground, surviving in various forms throughout the centuries of Christian orthodoxy. Elements of Gnostic spirituality can be found in medieval mysticism, Renaissance Hermeticism, and the esoteric traditions that flourished on the margins of mainstream Christianity. The Cathars of medieval France developed practices remarkably similar to those described in the Nag Hammadi texts. The Christian mystics, like Meister Eckhart, taught methods for achieving unity consciousness that echo Gnostic instructions for transcending ordinary awareness. Even the Protestant Reformation, with its emphasis on direct personal relationship with the divine, revived themes that had been central to Gnostic Christianity. But it wasn't until the discovery of the Nag Hammadi library that these underground traditions could be understood in their proper historical context. Suddenly, scholars could see that what they had taken to be isolated mystical movements were actually fragments of a much larger tradition of spiritual practice that had been systematically suppressed by institutional Christianity. The implications of this realization are still being worked out in academic circles, but the practical implications are already becoming clear to anyone willing to experiment with the methods preserved in these ancient texts. Dr. Stanislav Grof, a psychiatrist who has spent over 50 years researching non-ordinary states of consciousness, has noted that people who work seriously with Gnostic practices often report profound healing of psychological and spiritual wounds that conventional therapy has been unable to touch. The direct encounter with transcendent dimensions of reality appears to provide a kind of healing that works at deeper levels than ordinary therapeutic interventions. This healing potential was central to Gnostic spirituality from the beginning. The Gospel of Truth describes Gnosis not just as knowledge, but as a therapeutic process that heals the fundamental alienation between human consciousness and its divine source. According to this text, most human suffering stems from a kind of spiritual amnesia, a forgetting of our true nature that can be healed through direct remembrance of our divine origins. Modern trauma research has begun to validate this understanding of healing. Dr. Bessel van der Kolk and other researchers have demonstrated that the deepest forms of psychological healing often involve experiences that transcend ordinary consciousness and reconnect people with dimensions of themselves that trauma had made inaccessible. The practices described in Gnostic texts appear to facilitate exactly this kind of healing. They provide methods for accessing states of consciousness that lie beyond the reach of traumatic conditioning, spaces of awareness where the fundamental wholeness of human nature can be directly experienced. The Apocalypse of Adam suggests that this healing potential isn't limited to individual psychology, but extends to collective trauma as well. According to this text, entire cultures can suffer from spiritual amnesia, forgetting their connection to transcendent reality and becoming trapped in cycles of violence and ignorance. This collective dimension of Gnostic healing may be particularly relevant to our contemporary situation. We live in a time when traditional sources of meaning and purpose have been undermined by scientific materialism, when the sacred dimensions of existence have been largely forgotten, when many people feel disconnected from any sense of transcendent reality. The Nag Hammadi texts suggest that this cultural crisis isn't inevitable. They preserve records of communities that successfully integrated scientific inquiry with mystical experience, rational analysis with direct spiritual perception, individual development with collective healing. The discourse on the 8th and 9th provides perhaps the clearest example of this integration. This text describes a spiritual practice that involves both careful intellectual preparation and spontaneous breakthrough into transcendent awareness. The practitioner doesn't abandon reason in favor of mysticism or reject spiritual experience in favor of materialism. Instead, they learn to use both rational and intuitive capacities to explore the full spectrum of reality. This kind of integral approach to knowledge may be exactly what our culture needs to heal the split between science and spirituality that has characterized Western thought for the past several centuries. The Gnostic texts demonstrate that this split isn't necessary, that it's possible to honor both empirical investigation and direct spiritual experience, both critical thinking and mystical insight. But integrating these approaches requires more than just intellectual understanding. It requires the kind of practical training in consciousness development that the Gnostic communities specialized in. And that training, as preserved in the Nag Hammadi texts, remains as relevant today as it was 2,000 years ago. The question is whether our culture is ready to take seriously the possibility that these ancient texts might contain practical wisdom that could help heal our contemporary spiritual crisis. Are we prepared to consider that the traditions suppressed by 4th century church leaders might have something valuable to offer our 21st century world? The answer to that question is still being written. But the ripples from Muhammad Ali's discovery continue to spread, reaching minds and hearts that are hungry for the kind of spiritual nourishment that institutional religion has often failed to provide. In meditation centers and university laboratories, in therapy offices and online communities, people are rediscovering the consciousness-expanding practices that the Gnostic texts preserved. They're finding that these ancient methods still work, that they still provide access to dimensions of reality that mainstream culture has forgotten how to perceive. And they're discovering something else as well, that the spiritual independence these texts represent isn't just a historical curiosity. It's a living possibility, a way of approaching the sacred that doesn't require submission to external authority, but instead cultivates the divine potential that exists within human consciousness itself. This is the true revolution that the Nag Hammadi discovery represents. Not just the recovery of lost historical information, but the revival of a way of being human that institutional Christianity tried to eliminate from the world forever. The forbidden scrolls of Nag Hammadi aren't just ancient artifacts. They're seeds of transformation, planted in the Egyptian desert 16 centuries ago, and now beginning to sprout in the consciousness of anyone brave enough to water them with serious practice and sincere inquiry. The monks who buried these texts were betting on human potential. They were wagering that someday humanity would be mature enough to handle the spiritual technologies that their own generation had declared too dangerous for public use. That someday may be now. The question is, what are we going to do with the wisdom they preserved for us? Because the real secret, hidden in those leather-bound codices, wasn't just information about early Christianity. It was practical knowledge about human consciousness itself, methods for accessing the deepest potentials of human awareness, techniques for healing the ancient wound between spirit and matter that has haunted Western civilization for 2 millennia. The Gnostics understood something that we're only beginning to remember, that human beings are not separate from the divine reality we seek, but are expressions of it. We don't need to wait for salvation in the afterlife, or depend on institutional mediation for spiritual access. The kingdom of heaven, as the Gospel of Thomas insists, is already within us and around us, waiting to be discovered by anyone with eyes to see. The forbidden scrolls of Nag Hammadi have given us back something that was never supposed to return, a vision of Christianity so radically different from what we know that it forces us to question everything we thought was settled about the past, about spirituality, about human potential itself. These texts reveal that the triumph of Orthodox Christianity wasn't inevitable. It was a political victory achieved through systematic suppression, book burning, and the elimination of entire communities that dared to preserve alternative teachings. The monks who buried these scrolls understood that they were protecting more than just ancient manuscripts. They were preserving the memory of what humanity once knew about itself and what it might become again. Today, as these ancient practices are being validated by neuroscience and consciousness research, we're discovering that the Gnostics weren't deluded mystics, but sophisticated explorers of human awareness. Their methods still work, their insights still transform lives, their vision of spiritual independence still threatens every institution that claims exclusive access to truth. The real question isn't whether these texts are historically accurate or theologically correct. The question is whether we're brave enough to experiment with the consciousness-expanding techniques they preserve, whether we're ready to take responsibility for our own spiritual development, whether we're prepared to discover that the divine reality we've been taught to seek outside ourselves has been within us all along. Muhammad Ali's mattock didn't just uncover ancient books. It cracked open the tomb of human potential that institutional religion has kept sealed for 16 centuries. What emerges from that crack isn't just historical knowledge. It's the living possibility of a spirituality based on direct experience rather than borrowed belief, on inner knowing rather than external authority, on the recognition that every human being carries the same divine spark that illuminated the greatest saints and sages. The ripples from that broken jar are still spreading. The question is, will you let them reach you?